Hello and welcome back to Dwarf Fortress. I'm Hoodie here, and I've spent the past couple weeks building a beekeeping colony capable of surviving solely off its own supply of mead. It all started when I read the wiki page on beekeeping and discovered just how terrible mead production really is. To produce 5 units of mead, you need to 1. Install a fresh colony into a hive, 2. Wait 6 months for the bees to get busy, 3. Harvest and press the 1 honeycomb you've been rewarded with, and then 4. Use that honey to finally brew some mead. This slow pace of production, alongside the 40 hive soft cap the game defaults to, and the terribly low beverage value of mead, seriously, how is it on the same level as sewer brew and swamp whiskey, means that mead, as well as most other beekeeping sub-industries, is best utilized as a side industry or project that can keep your dwarves occupied and your alcohol stockpiles varied, rather than as the main industry of a fortress. Which is exactly why I set out to build a fortress where beekeeping would be the focus and mead would be the only drink available. But before I could start doing anything with bees, I first had to embark around to a couple different sites to find an active honeybee hive. Once I found one, I immediately got my dwarves to build a handful of hives up on the surface by the wagon so that my beekeeper could get to work splitting colonies and growing our bee population, while everyone else went to work mining, decorating, and smoothing a fortress a couple layers below ground. The design I went with for the fortress featured a large central hall that I planned on filling with beehives once our starter colonies above ground were ready to be split. The only problem with that was that beehives technically have to be above ground, or at least adjacent to an above ground tile, in order for the bees inside to actually produce honey. Fortunately, the system by which Dwarf Fortress determines whether a tile is above ground or not is pretty simple. If the sun has ever touched it, it's above ground. And so, after digging some holes down from the surface to the tiles in the fortress that I wanted to build hives on, my main hall was subterranean no more, and my dwarves could get to work building hives, splitting colonies, and filling the fortress with thousands of easily angered bees. Getting dwarves and bees to live alongside each other was easy enough. If you build hives and beds close enough together, they don't really have a choice, but getting them to stop agitating and attacking one another was a whole different beast. While I had an idea that making all my dwarves woodworkers and soldiers and teaching them to communicate through dance could maybe bridge the gap, I eventually just decided that getting stung by bees was the cost of doing business, and if anything, just served to remind my dwarves of their purpose in this fortress. It was around this point, when the first honeycombs were being pressed and the first barrels of mead were being brewed, that I did some quick back-of-the-napkin mead math and determined that my already quite slight population of 19 dwarves was actually already at, or maybe slightly beyond, the upper limit of the number of dwarves I could support in my fortress if I wanted mead to be the only drink in town. 40 hives multiplied by 2 harvests per year multiplied by 5 units of mead per harvest yields a theoretical upper limit of 400 units of mead per year, which could support about 20 dwarves. But each step of mead production takes a little bit of time to perform, and so the system, as with all systems where dwarves must be relied on, would not be perfectly efficient. With that in mind, I decided to send some of my dwarves out into the wilderness, never to come back again. I wasn't sure whether this was a merciful move that saved them from a lifetime of being stung by bees and drinking the worst alcohol in the game, or if I was dooming them to die to one of the many roaming wolf packs in the area. Either way, I had to come up with a list of dwarves to expel, and so I decided to be practical and send away all the dwarven families who had brought children into my fortress. It just didn't seem very efficient to have dwarves consuming mead while doing nothing to produce it. Once the families were gone, I was left with 14 dwarves, a main hall full of bees, and a couple work orders that would prompt my dwarves to produce mead as necessary, and so I decided that it was time to take my hands off the game and observe my dwarves at work for a year so I could see just how perpetual this mead machine could be. While the mead stockpile dipped into single digits at a couple points across the year, my dwarves never had to go without, and by the end they had even produced a slight surplus. At the same time, I tracked how often the non-bee residents of my fortress were stung, and determined that, across the 48 weeks in a Dwarf Fortress year, there were 49 stingings, so just slightly more than one a week. With the proof of concept tested and the fortress seemingly ready, I decided to finally take the training wheels off by locking the front door of the fortress and destroying our well, leaving my dwarves with nothing to drink but mead. While spending years watching my dwarves be inexplicably upbeat while doing nothing but getting stung and drinking low-value alcohol sounded pretty fun, I eventually grew tired of the ultra-mundane torture I was putting them through and retired so they could continue with their Sisyphean task on their own. This fortress was my first time messing around with beekeeping, and while it still seems like a bit of a waste of time if you're trying to be efficient in your fortress in any way at all, I had a lot of fun with it. At the very least, the idea of installing hives in high-traffic areas of a fortress to farm bee stings and subtly torture my dwarves will stick with me going forward. But for now, I'll just say thanks for watching, an extra thank you to those of you who support me on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.